Welcome, I'm Dr. Anand Senthi, and this is a short summary version of the talk, Evidence-Based Fraud and the End of Statistical Significance. The full version of the talk is available on the website ebm2.0.com with points spelt as a word. So what this talk is about is that there's a scandal in medicine where we found that most of our published research findings are false. And this was first told to us back in 2003 by John Ioannidis. Now, he pointed out using statistical simulations that using the techniques that we're using, the p-values and the thresholds of 0.05, that most of our research findings will be false, even though they are statistically significant. He went on to show us that the findings were most likely to be false if there were a number of red flags. One, if the effect sizes were really small, often I refer to as the EBM double whammy, because we don't really care about the result because the effect is small and it's unlikely to be true anyway. If there's a greater number of tested relationships, if there's greater flexibility in the way you design or define the trial or the outcomes or the models you use, where there are greater conflicts of interest, and obviously there are many of those, but the funder of the trial is a big one, and a large one that hasn't really been well addressed in EBM to date is about the biological plausibility and what I'll refer to later as pretest probability of the finding being true, which is actually critically important in deciding whether it is true or not. Later in 2013, Prasad published a key paper where they looked at the New England Journal of Medicine at 10 years of their publications and their original article section, and found that of all the articles, 1 in 9 was actually a reversal of the previous standard of care, i.e. we had published something saying, yep, this works, let's use it, spent lots of money on it, and then we found out later that we were wrong. And that was happening obviously very frequently. Then Ferreira Perez, just last year, expanded that to taking in the Lancet and JAMA as well, and looked at 15 years of their papers and found more than 500 reversals of previous standards of care. So just more than 500 reversals of a previous published positive finding. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because firstly, a number of those of potential reversals get suppressed by conflicted peer review. But the other big thing is most of the times we just accept these findings as being true. They get a p-value less than 0.05, we think they're true, we start using medical practice and nobody ever studies them again. So it's really just the tip of the iceberg of all the incorrect and false findings that we've been publishing and using in medicine. And where is this happening? Why is this happening? The first reason is bias. There's an enormous amount of types and amounts of bias in our studies, in our evidence-based medicine world. And we won't go through all of them now, but a number of cases and examples are provided in the full version of this talk. And one of the key things to realize about bias is that most of the forms, apart from the ones confounding and selection bias, don't actually go away when you randomize patients. Most of the forms of bias stay there, even in big trials where you randomize patients, you still have lots and lots of bias that affects your study results. One of the biggest types, one of the most undetectable types of bias that occurs, is that there's no obligation of researchers to publish any findings or trials that they don't want to that show negative or harmful results. None whatsoever. And the best example of this is Ioannidis published another paper last year, which showed that 96% of published p-values were less than 0.05. 96% less than 0.05. In research, most of our findings are negative. Most of the things that you test are negative. So if 96% of published p-values are positive, it means that we are not seeing the vast majority of research findings. They're all being either suppressed entirely or demonstrated in words but with no actual p-values provided and essentially dismissed and hidden, which just shows a huge amount of publication bias and tells you that we're living in basically a fantasy world. The EBM world is just a fantasy world of the best possible version of events that we could give to our studies, when in actual fact, if we took all the data into account, most of our findings would be false. One of the other issues with our approach is that I don't think we fully appreciated how much bias actually affects the statistical calculations. So the p-value calculation is actually a simultaneous test of a number of assumptions at once, not just the fact that whether the null hypothesis is true, which is what we thought it was testing. It's actually testing that and other assumptions simultaneously. And one of them is that there's effectively no bias in the study. So if there is actually any bias in the study, that number you get, P of 0.02 or whatever you actually get, doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean anything really about the null hypothesis, because it's testing several assumptions at once. And if there's bias, one of those assumptions has failed, and that number is no longer valid for what we're using it for. But the other reason, and the big reason, why we've been getting this so wrong, and our statistics, the way we use statistics has been wrong, is that we didn't really understand what the p-value was. We were taught wrong. Our basic understanding, a basic definition of the p-value as telling us something that could indicate the chance that our hypothesis was wrong, or that an alternative hypothesis is true, was actually incorrect. And what this landmark paper by Professor Regina Nuzzo in Nature 2014, one of the most widely read Nature papers ever, showed us that p-values were actually likelihood ratios. They convert a pretest probability of a finding being true into a post-test probability of a finding being true, where the study in question is considered the test and the p-value is the accuracy of the test. So if you take, for example, a situation which in most of the cases when we first study something in medicine to see if something works, it's highly unlikely to work. Most of the great inventions and easy things to prove that worked and great treatments that have already been discovered years ago. And now we're looking for very small benefits in drugs that often cost horrendously high amounts. And so when you actually start looking and start doing the trials, the chance of an effect is very low, probably something like 5%, 5 to 10%. So if you start with the pretest probability of say 5, 10%, and you do a study and you get a p-value of 0.05, then that converts that 5% chance of this being true to an 11% chance of this being true, but an 89% chance of this being false. So just to be clear, 11% chance of being true, not 95% chance of being true, which is what we thought the p-value was telling us when it was 0.05. Huge difference. And that right there explains the big reason why most of our study findings are false. We didn't understand what the p-value was telling us. Obviously, it gets better if our p-values are lower. And if your p-value was, say, 0.01, that 5% would now become 30%. But still, 70% chance that you're wrong. Now, once you've done a few studies and you start building up your pretest probability, start making it more likely. Oh yeah, one study showed it was true, another study showed it was true. Now maybe before you do your big study, you've got a pretest probability of, say, 50%, maybe it's 50-50 that your study hypothesis is true. Then, of course, the p-values can give you better post-test probabilities. If your p-value is 0.05, your post-test probability now has gone from 50% to 71%. If it's 0.01, it's gone to 89%. Still substantial chances that you can be wrong, though. Now, following this, a complete misuse of the p-value, the American Statistical Association, the largest professional body of statisticians in the world, got together and actually provided a position statement on the p-value to clear all this up so that we could stop making these mistakes going forward. And they provided this in 2016, and it said, one of the key statements, there was a number of statements, but one of the key statements was, p-values do not measure the probability that the study hypothesis is true or the probability that the data were produced by random chance alone. Hello, that's exactly what I thought the p-value was, and that's exactly what we were all taught the p-value was. So this really blew my mind, and just shook the foundations of evidence-based medicine. Now they have since last year published a whole month of their journal, the American Statistician, regarding the p-value and how we should approach it. And some of their key opening statements were: don't believe an association of effect exists just because it was statistically significant. Don't believe that an association of effect is absent just because it wasn't statistically significant. And that's critically important too, because if your p-value is above 0.05, it doesn't mean it's not a true effect. We still need to keep studying these findings. But also, don't conclude anything of scientific or practical importance based on statistical significance or lack thereof. Pretty damning about the p-value and statistical significance. But their main recommendation was, don't say statistically significant. And they go into great depth to explain why, and this is discussion in the full version of this talk, that is basically a meaningless term to dichotomize into a world of less than 0.05 or above 0.05 as positive and negative makes no statistical sense whatsoever. And as you can see, even being less than 0.5 doesn't really improve your pre-test probabilities or post-test probabilities in any way we thought it did. So they go on to give us several different approaches and thoughts about how we can actually practice evidence-based medicine using something called the ATOM principle, accepting uncertainty, being thoughtful, open, and modest. And this is discussed in detail in the full version of this talk. So following that, scientists around the world have been rising up against statistical significance, signing petitions to ban the use of that term and that concept, which is something that we all need to do now. So at the end of this talk, I chart a path forward, which I've called EBM 2.0, that essentially EBM 1.0, our initial version that we're still using, isn't fit for purpose and it needs to be upgraded. And some of the take-home messages for the EBM 2.0 approach are that we have to actually become savagely skeptical. We have to assume that study findings are false until rigorously proven otherwise. We've all as clinicians been inclined to want our treatments to work and want to have new treatments and want to help our patients. And that inclination to want to help has made us really kind of internally biased towards believing things. And I myself have changed from being an early adopter to now a skeptic, having read all this material and understanding the meaning of all our data. And what you need to do is, what I say is, make the data wine and dine you, right? Make the data, have to prove itself to you, okay? To take you on to one study, two studies, one date, second date, third date, before you make the data your bedfellow. Make it wine and dine you with shiny low p-values and studies with no bias, and do it again and again before you believe in findings, and don't just believe them like we used to. And another key message is accept uncertainty. There are no positive and negative trials. They're all just trials that take us through different levels of uncertainty until we get to a level of certainty that we're comfortable with. Each replication that we do, each study, if it has a positive finding, each time if we replicate that same finding again, our level of certainty will go up and up, converting pre-test probabilities to post-test probabilities, just like in that NASO paper, until we get to an acceptable level of certainty, what I often call the certainty change model, that we're happy to change practice at. So if you've got a drug, and this is going to come down to the real world costs and benefits of your drug. So if you've got a drug that's a new drug that's horrendously expensive, that probably has relatively small benefits, as most of our new drugs do, and still some harm, then we need the highest levels of certainty before we're happy to change practice. And really, it probably should be around the kind of 95% certainty mark, because that was the standard that we thought we had before, and we probably should still have for these new expensive drugs that have relatively low benefits. Whereas if we've got an old drug that's really safe and super cheap, and seems to have some benefit, then we might accept much lower levels of certainty before we are happy to change practice, and that might be completely reasonable. And so two other take-home messages: that one, we have to abandon EBM 1.0 statistics, so no more statistical significance, no more p less than 0.05. Confidence intervals are just equally bad, and that's discussed in the talk. And replace this with a Bayesian approach, where we talk about probabilities of our actual clinical hypothesis being true and converting from pre to post-test probabilities. And when we do this, we have to price in some bias and discount our results accordingly. And these numbers that we work out with these Bayesian approaches of using likelihood ratios, which are the p-values, they give us a number that firstly is the highest possible number that it can be, because they use maximum likelihood ratios. But secondly, they don't include any bias. So if there's any bias, we need to discount them, and we need to discount them knowing that there's always going to be some undetectable bias in our studies, and that's discussed more in the full version of the talk. And the last point, take-home message is, we need to use EBM 2.0 in the future for all future evidence, but we have to also go back and reevaluate our past, and there are a number of suspect candidates out there and therapies that we're using that we need to go back and look at using the EBM 2.0 lens, and potentially stop using these therapies. And a few key candidates are discussed in the main version of the talk. So if you understand, are moved by this and want to change what all of our clinicians around the world and all of our EBM researchers are doing, then spread the word, share this website, ebm2.0.com, and hashtag EBM2. When you're discussing evidence or talking about this on Twitter, use the hashtag. The quicker we can spread this message and have this knowledge translation, the quicker we can start actually changing the way we approach evidence so that we're actually coming up with therapies that really do work for our patients and doing the best for our patients. Thanks very much for your time.